Piña Soul Podcast with Dr. Jessica Hernandez.
In today's episode, we're diving into Poppy State, a labyrinth of plants and a story of beginnings by Myriam Gurba, a powerful blend of memoir, botany, and cultural critique. Gurba takes us through California's landscapes, showing how plants, language, and history shape identity, power, and belonging. Structured like a labyrinth, this book weaves together personal stories and the natural world in surprising ways. Today, we will explore how this text challenges who gets to define place and history and how storytelling can become a form of resistance and healing, especially from gender-based violence. We hope you enjoy it and make sure to check out her book.
Hello, welcome, and we're excited to have Myriam today. Thank you for joining us today in our podcast episode.
Thank you so much. I'm honored and excited.
Yeah, I really enjoy reading your book, and I also love the cover. I think that it's very vibrant, right? Especially given the themes and topics that you actually discuss, which are not necessarily as vibrant or colorful in that sense. But my first question, and this is something that I loved about your book, is that Poppy State is structured as a maze rather than a memoir or essays. And I
Yes.
wanted to ask you, why a maze? And what do you want readers to discover by getting lost?
I love this question. And I structured it as a maze or a labyrinth that can be approached either way for various reasons. The primary reason is that susto is central to the narrative. And I wanted to give the reader a vicarious experience of getting lost, right? Because when one has susto, one's soul is lost. And so I wanted for the reader to have sort of a synthesized experience of wandering through a narrative and not necessarily knowing where it is that they are going. The other reason that I thought that a labyrinth would be interesting is that there are villains in Poppy State. One of those villains is somebody who I named the Marijuana Prince. And so I devised this labyrinth because I imagine capturing that villain within that labyrinth. And perhaps by capturing him in that labyrinth and in that maze, he can't exit and harm other people.
Wow, thank you. That's very powerful because it's like in a way you're making them or him being lost in his own doing, and that's very beautiful. And then you hint also at susto, which is the central theme of your book. And I wanted to ask you if you can describe susto, especially for our audience who might not be familiar with that term.
Absolutely. Susto is a spiritual sickness that has some similarities to other sort of conditions that people might be familiar with. For example, it has a lot of commonalities with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, although the spiritual nature of it differentiates it. And so when a person experiences susto, what occurs is that a person often has some sort of brush with death, right? What we would call a trauma. And as a result of that trauma, the soul separates from the body. And sometimes the soul wanders, sometimes the soul travels. And when I use the word soul, I'm referring to like a sense of vitality, right? Like our vitality is being drained from us. And so that can result in the soul wandering, but it can also result in the soul getting sort of wedged somewhere and getting stuck, right? So the soul can get wedged in the earth and we have to call it back from the earth. The soul can get stuck in water. The soul can get stuck in a tree. And so we need to locate that soul and then call that soul home.
Yeah, thank you for describing that because I know in indigenous spirituality, right, especially from Latin America, we often say, "Oh, you have to susto, we have to cure your susto." And oftentimes, one of the things that I have learned even throughout my own journey is that sometimes we can inherit our parents' or grandparents' susto. And that is like, it blew my mind because I was like, I
Okay.
didn't live through that. So why is it that I'm having these memories?
When I read your book, you describe inheriting historic trauma from your father, and despite not having survived what is called a civil war, you still are impacted by the memories of the Civil War. And I also raised those issues of historic trauma in Poppy State by mentioning how I experienced this villain who I call the Marijuana Prince, who's a domestic abuser, but there are women in my lineage who had their own villains, who had their own susto brought about by men who also abused. So yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and I really love that you talk about susto, right? Because it's kind of contextualizing it from our own communities. And now Western science is like, this is intergenerational trauma, even though susto has been in our generations for like, since pre-colonization, I'm assuming. And
Absolutely.
another thing that I really love, especially, being raised in California, is that you transform the California golden poppy from a state symbol into both a weapon and medicine. And I wanted to ask you, what does it mean to weaponize beauty, especially given that oftentimes beauty is associated with being fragile, with being this like pristine, delicate figure?
This is such an interesting question, and I love it. I The weaponization of beauty is something that I have thought of, especially in terms of gender-based violence and in terms of domestic violence. I do think that the that when domestic violence unfolds, often the perpetrator is weaponizing beauty against his victim. And I'm using gendered terms because that's been my experience of domestic violence. It's been very like heteronormative. And so the perpetrator can take uh what we perceive as romantic beauty, right? Like, for example, the giving of flowers, and they're sort of laying a trap for this person who they're going to capture and then hold within this battering relationship, within an abusive relationship. So those perpetrators can do that. But in the case of Poppy State, I kind of reclaim those flowers, right? And then I take those flowers and use them as medicine in order to combat the abuser who has used romance, including the romance of flowers, in order to sort of draw me in and ensnare me.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that because it was something that I noticed, especially given that, flowers are often beautiful, right? Like they're deemed to be beautiful, but I really like how you also weaponize them and also use them as medicine to reclaim your healing. And I guess going back to susto, how would you describe the feeling of losing one's soul after trauma? And what does it mean to reclaim it, especially given that this is something that you discuss in your book a lot?
I love this question. So, my experience of susto, in order to describe my experience of susto, I'll go to two particular moments. So, there was a moment during my teen years when I think that this really began, right? So, this really had its origins very early. So, when I was 19 years old, I was assaulted by a stranger. And I think that that was when my soul first began to leave me. And when that assault happened, right? And it happened in public. It was a stranger who attacked me from behind. Witnessed the assault from outside of my body. So I became a bird, right? And I was watching myself from above. So I had a bird's eye view of what was happening to me. Then I became almost like a worm or a snail. So I had like this worm's eye view or this snail's eye view of what was happening to me. So I was outside of my body watching myself. And so I think that that was when my soul first started to distance herself from me, because my soul felt that my body was an unsafe place because the world was making my body an unsafe place. Later on, decades after, when I had experienced domestic violence and escaped, I again kind of took stock and took inventory of my life. And I realized that something was very wrong. And I looked at my apartment and I realized that you could hardly tell that somebody lived there because there was very little like adornment on the walls. I was scared to decorate and I had very little furniture. And I realized that the reason why I am not decorating and the reason why I'm not acquiring sort of the objects that are necessary to running a household is because I'm scared of having roots, right? Because I have had to run so frequently and escape so frequently. And it's terrifying to think that you would have to uproot your whole life to save yourself again. And so plants helped me learn how to root myself. So that's how plants became instrumental in bringing my soul home. They sort of whispered to me, Myriam, you need roots, and we're going to show you how to regrow them.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that because oftentimes, even plants or animals speak to us, obviously not in human form, but you can sense it, especially if you build that connection with them. So that's very beautiful that plants also helped you heal. Going back to plants, and this is one of the main topics that oftentimes I discuss in my own work, and I really love that you brought it forward, is that you write about white women botanists, right? And who are both admirable and complicit. How do you reconcile with these contradictions? And what do we owe the plants whose names were erased, especially by also white women botanists?
So, when I was researching Poppy State, I began to research the local history of botany. I grew up in Santa Barbara County and I was born in Santa Maria, California. And I began to learn about a woman whose name I had heard before, but I learned much more about her during that research. Her name is Ida Mae Blockman. And there are actually schools named after her husband in the community where I grew up. Mae Blockman was a school teacher. She was also um, what was called a citizen botanist. This was a person who was a self-appointed botanist who behaved as if they were discovering plants as a pioneer, but she wasn't discovering plants. These plants were kin to the Chumash people, who are the native stewards of the region that she had settled in and that she participated in colonizing, right? So she spoke over these plants and she spoke over the Chumash, right? Because the Chumash had already named these plants. So they had names, but she renamed them. Then there were also other botanists who named plants in her honor. And while I think that the desire to botanize is admirable, and I think that the desire to categorize plants can be admirable, and the desire to sort of teach people about plants is very admirable, because that was something that she was committed to doing as a teacher. She was a high school teacher and she encouraged her students to learn gardening. What she did was also quite damaging, right? And very pernicious. I recently attended the viewing of a film that's still in the process of being made. This film is about fire ecology, and the producers of the film are Kumeyaay folks. And they were saying that it's so important to learn the names of our native plants because the plants long to hear those names, because those are their original names. And so the plants themselves have a nostalgia for it, and it strengthens the plants, right? And it revives them and revitalizes them to be spoken to in a language that's very familiar. And so he urges us to learn those indigenous names of the plants that are in our communities. And I think that that's what we owe the plants, is a return of those names and to say those names. And so I have a practice of not necessarily doing that, but I'm, for example, reconnecting with the indigenous nations that I descend from and have been learning some vocabulary. For example, I now know the Coca word for wildflowers, which is chilpopotalacqua. And so now, for example, when I'm going hiking, I'll be like, oh, chilpopotalacqua, so that the plants can hear familiar language, you know?
Yeah, that's beautiful and also a strong message, right? Because oftentimes when we bring these discussions to, a botanist society, people are like, well, it's really difficult to pronounce it. And I'm like, you're pronouncing European names that are for us very difficult to begin with.
Right. Sometimes the names that the plants have been given, and it's all consonants. I don't know how to pronounce that. So if I have to adapt to learning your languages, show me the courtesy of learning ours too. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that because, yeah, that's something that I often struggle with. And another thing that I loved about your book is that you focus on animal relatives that are not often romanticized, right? I often think of animals like polar bears, like those beautiful animals that are often, in a way, building compassion in
Mhm.
humankind. But you focus on insects such as grasshoppers and ants, right? And these are often beings that are often ignored in mainstream environmentalism. So I wanted to ask you, what do grasshoppers and ants teach us that dominant environmental narratives do not teach us?
I love this question because so often megafauna, like the charismatic megafauna, like elephants and polar bears, like you mentioned, are elevated above the creepy crawlies, right? And the creepy crawlies sometimes inspire fear. They trigger a sense of danger, and people feel a sense of revulsion or disgust. And because the creepy crawlies tend to inspire that, I feel an affinity for them because I think that sometimes I might trigger that in people. So I feel like When I see, for example, a centipede, I'm like, I feel you. So that's one reason why I have that affection for them. And I think another reason that I have an affection for them is because I grew up gardening with my father. And I spent an incredible amount of time um with my hands in dirt. And when you do that, you share your life with insects. Like it's unavoidable, right? So you're going to encounter ants, you're going to encounter grasshoppers, you're going to encounter scorpions, right? And so they've never bothered me. And the spider was sort of instrumental in saving me from domestic violence. So the abuser who I sort of aestheticize as the marijuana prince in Poppy State um, was a very violent man, but his Achilles heel was arachnophobia. He was terrified of spiders. And so when I was living with him, he could be the cruelest man in the world, but the moment a spider would rear her head, he would be screaming and on a chair and saying, Miriam, go kill it. And I was like, how is it that you can beat me up, but you can't beat up a spider? So when I escaped from him, one of the very first things that I did was get a tattoo of a spider. So this is like my protective talisman. So it's like, you come near me, you have to go through him. So I love them. They perform incredibly important functions, right? So they help to cycle nutrients, right? These creepy crawlies are pollinators. So they're just as important to ecosystems as polar bears and elephants.
That's crazy, and I admire you for sharing that story and also getting the spider right. Because yeah, we often deem them as like, yeah, they deserve death. We should step on them. We should get rid of them. But when we talk about other animals that are often amplified, right? It's like we're crying for them for their deaths, and they play the same vital role in our
Exactly.
ecosystems as well. And I really loved how you also bring corn, right? Like maize. And you it appears, right, as a kin and ancestor, yet also as a site of exploitation. And I wanted to ask you, what does maize modern life reveal about how we treat what we claim to love?
That's so interesting. So when I was in the process of recovering from susto, I began to experience sort of like urges to grow specific plants, right? And one of the plants that I felt very called to grow was corn. I felt that I had to grow corn. And when I first began to heal, that was incredibly challenging for me because I was living in an apartment. So how do you grow corn in an apartment, right? And so I experimented and I had some experimental failures, but I was eventually able to leave that apartment and get to a place where I could grow corn. And I'm growing corn now, right? So I have some beautiful corn right now that is in my front yard. And the corn has taught me so much. And I give that corn um as an offering to my ancestors. So I have an ancestor altar and I choose some ears and I give it to them. And I also use the stalks to help construct altars. Corn has been, growing corn has been extremely rewarding for me. It's been very educational for me. But like you said, corn is also a site of exploitation. And I think the place where I have witnessed corn be sort of most abused has been when I have visited Iowa, because corn farming doesn't really happen as much in California. But I've gone to the Midwest on several occasions, and it's stunning to see corn as far as the eye can see, right? You just see cornfields all the way to the edge of the horizon, but they're very lonely because they're abandoned. The corn isn't being treated as kin. The corn is commodity. And it's very clear that the corn is commodity. And the corn almost seems soulless. And I think that that's because of the monoculture that results from the genetic modification of the organism, that the corn can't diversify herself in order to adapt and change to environments, that she's almost enslaved to a particular genome. And so for me, sort of the most heartbreaking experiences around corn have been seeing that industrial agriculture in Iowa.
Yeah, thank you for sharing the symbolism, right? Because when you go to Mexico or you see a milpa, it looks so happy. But then you go to Iowa and you're like, why do these corn look so sad? Like it's not nice.
They
It
do,
doesn't
they
make
look
you
sad
happy.
and they look stiff, like they want to be put out of their misery. Look like, Miriam, help me. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and it's crazy the dualities, right? Of like, what does it
Yeah,
mean to extract corn and exploit it versus putting corn as a kin and putting it next to relatives that also sustain it as well. But thank you for sharing that.
Exactly. Exactly. And it almost looks like the corn is being punished in the way that, like, you take a kid and you put the kid in timeout where the kid's all by himself because the corn's all by herself, like no bean, no squash, no tobacco, just corn, 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 you know?
Yes, and I feel like it loses its color too, right? Because it's corn's supposed to be vibrant, like really yellow, and it looks pale.
Yes. It's pale as hell. I'm like, what happened to this corn? This is so sad. Corn's not supposed to be güerita.
Which is funny, right? Because sometimes people say, "Oh, you have like pelos de elote, like corn hair," but in reality, corn hair is very like dark and red and not blonde or pale blonde.
Exactly. Exactly. That's funny.
Another thing that I noticed, right, when you were writing your book is that the Wizard of Oz appears throughout the book. And I wanted to ask you, what does that story keep colliding with your California and with your histories as well?
So, because Poppy State is a tale of susto, which is a condition where the soul is absent from her home, her body. I wanted to contrast that with other stories of home and finding home and longing for home. And one of those iconic sort of American stories about home with an iconic slogan about home is the Wizard of Oz, right? There's no place like home. And Dorothy becomes intoxicated by poppies. And so again, there was a connection with poppies. And then last, while the Wizard of Oz is set in Kansas, the film itself is shot in California. And so I'm writing about California. And so there's all these intersections with California. And so I've been to these various places that are somehow implicated in the Wizard of Oz. And so I wanted to tie that sort of cinematic and literary history into my own history.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I didn't even know it was actually filmed in California. That's crazy and the similarities, right? And one of the things that I wanted to ask you is that when you write, there are things that you soften with myth, but there are also things that you also leave brutal. How do you decide what to soften with myth and what to leave as brutal and as honest as you could?
Yeah. So in the case of Poppy State, I wanted to write about susto as a result of gender-based violence, of domestic violence. But because Poppy State enters these sorts of magical realms and time is not a constraint and space is not a constraint, I felt that it would be best to kind of aestheticize and soften the sort of gender-based violence so that it would present as part of this fairy tale as well. And I think that sometimes fairy tales are stronger representations of everyday violence than graphic representations. And as an example of that, I offer Little Red Riding Hood. The story of Little Red Riding Hood is a harrowing tale, right? And yet it's a fairy tale. The story of Hansel and Gretel and the witch is a story of child abuse, but it's a fairy tale. And so I looked to those fairy tales to inform the way that I aestheticized domestic violence.
Thank you for sharing that because I remember when I was younger, I read the original fairy tales and I was so like traumatized because they're not as cute, right?
They're extremely traumatizing. Like they're not for children.
But then for some reason, this thick book attracted me. And I was like, oh, let me read them. Oh, it says it has the, Red Riding Hood or Hansel and Gretel or The Little Mermaid. When I read it, I was like, what
And
is
so The Little Mermaid is horrifying. And then there is a version of Cinderella that's really horrifying too, where she's trying to get her foot to fit in the glass slipper. And so are her stepsisters. And they actually mutilate their feet. Right. And so it's like, that's not the Disney version.
Disney has lied to us?
So
And then one of the things that I loved also is that you described this book as written with ancestors and also non-human beings. And I wanted to ask you, what did that collaboration actually look like? And did any of them change your thinking as you were writing the book?
yes. So I wrote the book with ancestors and I have a practice of ancestor veneration. So I have an altar where I honor my ancestors daily and I petition them. and I bring them regular offerings. And so by cultivating that relationship with them, I'm in constant communication and they're in constant communication with me. And I find different ways that they speak to me throughout my day. And then as it relates to sort of the more than human, what I would do when I was working on Puppy State is I would visit my plant co-authors. So I grow a lot of native plants now on the land where I live, but some of the plants that I wrote about, I don't grow on the land. And so I had to visit them at their homes, which is the forest. And so what I did was I would go to the forest every day that I was writing and spend an hour or two there looking for the plants that I was writing about and then spending significant time with them so that they could reveal to me how they wanted to be represented because I didn't want to misrepresent them. And I had a list of plants in mind that I wanted to write about that had been very instructive to me and had played a role in sort of shaping who I am. And one of those plants is the elderberry. And I went to the Angeles forest and I spent a lot of time with some very beautiful elderberries that were very shy. They they didn't really have much to say. Like they didn't mind spending time with me, but they didn't really have much story to share with me. And so I thought because of that, that the elderberry was sort of withdrawing from the project and I had to honor that, right? And so I had thought that the elderberry would not make it into the narrative. But then I went to go visit my parents and my dad, who's my botanical mentor, asked me to go for a walk with him. So we went for a walk in the front yard, which is really, really large. And as we were walking, he pointed to an elderberry. And he says to me, Miriam, he says, do you remember planting this elderberry when you were a little girl? And I said, did I plant it? I don't remember planting it. And he goes, the reason you don't remember planting it is because you didn't plant it. He said, uh, of all the trees that we planted, the elderberries failed to thrive. So this is not one of those. He said, but he said, here it is. And he says, I think that this elderberry is from my father and that my father sent a bird and the bird was carrying an elderberry seed and the seed was dropped here and the plant chose to root herself here as sort of a gift from our ancestors. And the moment that my dad told me that, I was like, thank you, elderberry, because I had been waiting for almost a year for the elderberry to communicate with me. And that's one of the lessons that plants teach us is that we need to be patient in our communication. We often want to hasten communication and we want our needs met immediately, but plants function according to plant time.
Thank you for sharing that because that's very beautiful, right? It's like your grandfather sent that elderberry so that you guys can probably have a kin or somebody to look after your home, especially given that it's in front of your dad's home. That's
Mhm.
incredible.
Thank you.
And then I guess you kind of discussed this already, right? But like after writing this book, what other lessons have plant taught you about how to live inside a body, especially as a human body?
So I would say that one of the most gentle lessons that plants continue to impart to me is the necessity of lavishing oneself with love, right? And in doing so, making one's own body a beloved and sweet environment. Because when we sweeten ourselves, our souls want to stay, right? And so I have now like a regular practice of taking spiritual baths and I prepare those herbally. And so there are plants that I grow and plants that I occasionally forage that I regularly use for that cleansing and sweetening process. And I do that regularly because I also think that susto is a condition that requires consistent treatment. I don't think that a person necessarily heals all at once. I think that a person kind of needs to maintain that sort of stability and that rootedness. And that's one of the ways that I do that is by continuing to lavish myself with love the way that I lavish my plants with love.
Thank you for sharing. And I guess to kind of close our episode, right? One of the things that I have noticed about you is that you're a very joyful person. You love to laugh. And I was wondering, how did you learn how to find joy, especially after reading your book, right? Because you have been through a lot. And sometimes it's easier for us to be angry, to go into despair, or to lose that joy and hope. to keep thriving? How did you find your joy, or how did you reclaim it?
So I think one way that I've managed to sustain that sense of joy and to always keep that ember burning, even if it wasn't like a raging fire or a vibrant fire, one way that I kind of kept those embers alive is through maintaining my sense of humor. And I feel like it is very, very revolutionary for women endure gender-based violence to not lose that sense of humor, because I do think that that's one of our characteristics that perpetrators try to destroy, because it is what sustains us, the ability to laugh, right? Because laughter releases tension, and it resets the body and it resets the nervous system. So I understand that I need to laugh on a regular basis. And if there's no one around to provide me with laughter, then I have to provide it to myself. And so that's why I have found a way to look at the world through almost like what you might call humor goggles, where I'm always looking for what's funny. And that's what makes me smile. And I love making people laugh, and I love when people make me laugh. So again, humor's an amazing medicine.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, because I also find humor to be healing, right? And oftentimes it's easier for us to be angry or to lash out on people, or kind of, the saying that says hurt people hurt people. But oftentimes it's hard to turn that laughter off because I'm laughing in a serious moment. And people are just looking, right? Like, why is she laughing? This is not even funny. Yeah. But my final question is, if people were to take one lesson from your book, what is that one lesson you hope that readers take away from your book?
I would hope that readers would become interested in learning about the plants native to their region, and then would work to defend those plants and to know those plants, and to also learn about the stewards of those plants, the native people who steward the land where the readers live. So I hope that it would strongly encourage that.
Yeah, Miriam, thank you so much for joining us or for writing this amazing book. I really enjoyed reading it, and also kind of it allowed me to reflect a lot, right? Especially given what you talk about domestic violence and how oftentimes violence comes in different forms, and we have to find the joy, right? And also heal from it. So thank you so much for joining us today.
You're so welcome.